Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Ruoyun. I am a digital marketer. For the last 10 years, I have helped businesses that have been making change and impact in their world continue amplify that into their community with human-centered marketing and business. I'm so excited today to have the amazing Koy McDermott, and we've known each other for a long time. It's actually been wild how long we've known each other. And what I love about him is that he has been making talking about very tough culture conversations palatable for businesses to feel like they can implement best culture practices and allow quality and conversations to show up from the top down. So thank you so much being on here with us today. And please introduce yourself for our viewers and listeners.
For sure, and I appreciate it, Warren. So, just as you said, I've been helping businesses, organizations to be able to understand culture from the top down, right? It started with multi-generational workplaces and the workforce that we've got, really focusing in on the different generations, baby boomers, Gen X, Generation Y, or millennials, Gen Z. Now we moved into Generation Alpha, super, super exciting stuff. But while I was doing all of that, and I still do, I started to realize that there were individuals within the organization or groups of individuals within the organization who needed deeper, more resonating items. And that's what started the executive coaching that I do. And then also the millennial management leadership development that I do as well, helping my generational counterparts who are moving into management, into leadership, really get the skills and the development that they need that a lot of companies and organizations either cannot offer or the millennial managers who are in those trainings are unable to truly talk about some of the uh, things that are lying a bit below the surface. So having an external trainer come in and handle that has been absolutely amazing for the companies and businesses that I work with.
Yeah, absolutely. Because culture is about social best practices, aka mental health and things like that. Right. And so not everybody is on the same like level of mental health and personal growth. And you don't need to do that, right? Like as an agency, as a business owner in the past, we've done a lot of Brene Brown work, we've implemented a lot of leadership work. And so as it was like it was like our expectation to be able to set our teams up for success to invest in that leadership work, but we also had to honor that a lot of our team members, especially the young ones that are just entering the market, the job world, the aka the real world, and like here's how to be a full
Whole team,
functioning,
right?
right? Yes, and they're not on the same page. So I love that you're bridging that gap. And for those of you that are wondering, oh goodness, why are we having these conversations? It was like it needs to happen now because in this last year, the job description of digital marketers have changed,
Mm.
where we have went from like just creating the perfect picture or the view or like to having the online presence to attract our customers ideal clients through the door. It has shifted to, oh, we're now customer service, because essentially with the post pandemic, the technology has accelerated by 5 years and it's all digital connection. So we went from supporting the sales team to now being a part of the sales team and the customer service at the same time. And simultaneously, you have had events like Black Lives Matter. You had events and other different events around like social justice and values. And the expectation is set. And I've said this since last year about this, is that the expectation is set. Businesses have a voice, and this is very counterintuitive. Like we grew up, like Koy and I both came in the corporate world, and when we entered, it was separate of church and state. Businesses don't talk about social policies. Businesses don't talk about any of that stuff, even though there's a lot of behind the scenes conversations and lobbying, which is a whole other kettle of fish that we're not going to get into. But on the public facing side, businesses don't talk about these things. But post in 2020, that is no longer acceptable because, and this is the evolution of brands and why we're talking about this today and why it affects marketing today before we get into the nitty gritty of how culture and marketing can work side by side, is that since the 80s. marketers have established brands as living humans and organisms. And just as living humans and organisms, there's values associated with it, birds of a feather mentality that kicks in, and values and how you operate morally, which is the thing in this space. So that's in the 80s. Like the expectation has been set, and it basically took these last 20, 30 years to get it to a point of, oh, we have values. So like the 90s and like the early 2000s was kind of like that. Oh, what is values and mission statement was kind of like the term. And then now it's how do we live to that? And you saw that with Black Lives Matter, where businesses are expected to have a voice. Now, does it mean that every single social movement they're supposed to have a voice for? Not necessarily. Businesses have, like, just like human beings, there are things that you're very excited about and motivated by. Same thing for businesses as well. But the part that, and why Koy and I are having this conversation today, is that we are hitting a year from Black Lives Matter. We're almost at a year to this point, and many businesses and organizations said we're going to do better. And our humanistic instinct is silver bullet answers that have short term results. And we're like, we just got to peel this band aid and we'll fix this. And every HR culture person knows it's like, no, this is a very deep knot, because as human beings, my favorite analogy is that humans are onions. We're multi layered, lots of messiness. We could stink a little sometimes, but we are like the key that makes that recipe shine. And so it is a messy process, but it's a powerful process. So I set all of this up and to talk with Koy more today is about, we are hitting a year of Black Lives Matter. And let's talk a little bit about like the context that we're walking into, right? Because you mentioned about we have multi generations, we have this expectation, and so many business owners and top leaders are at this point of, we are at a year of Black Lives Matter, and we've essentially in this year explored and deep dived, hopefully, like they've done the value work that is needed, right? Yes, exactly. And so if they've done that, like what are the expectations, right? Because that's probably sitting on their minds as we get closer towards like the May, June timeframe. So that's like what's on their mind, but that's like, it's like in order to answer that question, we got a lot of layers. So I'm curious on like, Koy, if a business owner came up to you and asked that question, how would you like start with like setting up the scene to like really dig deep into that?
So I want to make sure that I'm fully understanding the question, right? Because there were, just as you said, so many pieces and so many layers. So um, what is the specific question that the business owner is asking, so that I can give a more specific answer? And then of course we can get into, kind of the more broader items that are there too.
Right, exactly. So like a lot of business owners and top leaders, there's this like behind the scenes conversations of, we said a year ago that we're going to do better. And there's a lot of fear that kicks in, a lot of scarcity that kicks in of, can we measure up to expectations? And simultaneously, you have a lot of like the employees, the customers, the lifeblood of the business. They're also wondering, what are the expectations? Like, there's no expectations technically set. So when you're asking for a specific answer, all I could say is like what I've been hearing and what we hear in conversations very naturally in this environment is this like, we have to match these expectations, but we have no idea what these expectations are. So therefore we have no idea how to solve this or expect to want to solve this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With that, I believe it's twofold. So I believe
Mhm.
that most companies, so because I have this conversation daily, I might as well use an example without necessarily speaking about
Yeah.
the congruence. But I had one of my clients ask a question similar to this, but it was more about what should the internal expectations be?
Mhm.
And as soon as I hear what should the internal expectations be, my mind immediately goes to, you're internal, so what are the expectations, right? It's like a question back to,
Right.
business. It's a question back to the client. If we're looking for an outside force to change and shift what's going on inside, it's just going to be something fleeting, right? It's going to be
Mm-hmm.
something that, because someone told me that I was pretty today or I was handsome today, now all of a sudden I feel like I'm on cloud nine. But if someone never says that to me, well, how do I feel about myself on a day-to-day basis? What is the
Right.
internal story that I'm telling myself? What does that recording sound like? And that's important for businesses, companies, organizations to really begin to embrace. What internally do you want to stand for? What are the internal expectations, right?
Right.
Diversity is a word that we toss around so often. And
Like
it,
as jargony as like authenticity is being jargoned.
yes, yeah, and like it has such a subjective definition. Sure, you can find the Merriam-Webster definition of the word diversity, but it has such a subjective definition that everyone feels differently. So in my
Right.
background, I used to work at Apple. I was a part of their enterprise, sales team, and then was promoted to their channel team. And while I was there, I found that diversity for them was really about the LGBTQ plus community. Not saying
Mm.
that they didn't care about, marginalized women or marginalized ethnicities or anything like that. More so saying that their focus from a
Mm-hmm.
diversity perspective was on the LGBTQ plus community.
Mm-hmm.
During my time at Google, their focus was on women in tech. Not that they
Mm-hmm.
didn't care about the LGBTQ plus community, not that they didn't care about men of color or anything like that, but more so that was the focus. And it's important for us
Mm-hmm.
to understand that everyone's not going to care about everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll
Yeah,
say that
let's
one more
let's
time. Everyone's not going to care about everything, and that's okay.
right, and let's dig a little bit deep into that because we are a year at Black Lives Matter, and there was this argument of like all lives matter, which I
Sure.
was like, politics aside, we're not talking about politics. This is not the part. This is not about politics. It's about how we as a society chooses to understand and treat each other as human beings, right? Like that's the large conversation, right? And when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, it's about taking out these isms, these
Yeah.
other isms,
Yeah.
right? But to your point, like, so in that era, and what you're seeing is what's happening in the context of society today is um the conversation of, okay, Black Lives Matter. When that first kicked out, people were like, all lives matter. And people were like, well, what about other minorities and all the things? And like, as another minority that fell in that category, and I had a lot of people ask me this question, I said, look, the fight is racism. It is the act of a single group pushing down and power overing another group of people based on the color of their skin. And it has historically been this way, but we must tackle the most extreme version because that sets the precedence of how we handle much more complex and gray area the conversations like Asian Americans. Like and it's really hilarious because I said that a year ago and we're now a year later talking about the same thing. Like we were like, if we did our work right and how we
Yeah.
handle about the black conversation of like how Black minorities are able to be treated and heal that process, then we can heal this process of like Asian American, which is like the gray area, right? Like you haven't heard or like it's not talked about. There's not apparent examples to base off of. There's not enough statistics, which is something I've also heard, right? Like which is a whole other kettle of
Hold
fish
on.
on those
Right.
things, right?
Right.
But to your point, it's like it's not that they're only focusing on one and not focusing on others. It's the fact that we are human beings. It's the same thing when we talk about normal business. If you're like, we're going to do all the things, I'm going to look at you and be like, okay, but you only have so much energy. So are you just going to do everything half-assed? Or are you going to actually like focus on three quarterly rocks and move that ticker along slowly? It's like a boat. You can't just go, whoop. You have
Right.
to like slowly move it over,
Right.
right? And so it's defining those pieces. And to your point of the companies that you mentioned, they were like, these are the ones that we can handle in this quarter, in this year.
Mhm.
and then we can do it well. Because and then the example that I would give from a societal standpoint is precedence, right? When we talk about all of these different changes, it's about changing into law, and people don't, right, they don't recognize that piece. They're like, this is how I feel, and this is how it should, and this is how I want it to change. But
Right.
the sustainable change is changing the system. And that applies for the society as a whole and for organizations. So, like in society, it's about changing laws, changing how court rulings are handled, and things like that. In business, same thing. It's about changing company procedure, culture handbooks, all the things like that. It's like we are given the ability to have a system where it is written in a language that is able to serve all humans, and that's what we want at the end of the day. But we have to be able to tackle it from one really hard case and then be able to, in order to do it for the other even potentially harder cases in that stage. So is that like a good reflection of what you're talking about when we're talking about companies only doing this, but it doesn't mean that we're like degrading the suffering that other people have felt, kind of
Yeah.
thing?
I mean, when it comes to this, just as you said, there are, I kind of see it as us all living on a cul-de-sac. When I was younger, I always wanted to live on a cul-de-sac. I just felt like cul-de-sacs were, super, super safe. You could do just about anything on a cul-de-sac because you weren't going to have cars like racing in and out, right? Um, but within this cul-de-sac, if we're all there and one home has caught fire and we continue to use buckets of water to put out that fire, as opposed to getting a fire truck in here to actually begin to put out this fire, at some point in time, those embers, those ashes are going to get onto your lawn. They're going to get onto your fence. They're going to get onto your home. And the next thing you know, there's going to be another fire, right? And we are continuously seeing the other fires spark up because we don't want to immediately handle what started it all, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
whenever we start to move into the globalization of racism, and what that
mm-hmm,
really means, we begin to get to the core of it. It's not that slavery was something that just appeared and happened with the transatlantic slave trade. It's something that
mm-hmm,
had been around. But typically, when it had happened, it was based upon conquering nations. So a
mm-hmm.
conquering nation would come in. Once they came in, they would enslave those individuals. There were times where some of those slaves and/or servants could buy their freedom, get out of servitude, etc.
Right.
So
Rome
that's
was a
a conquering
great
nation.
example of that. Yeah.
Yes, 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 right. So like that's a conquering nation coming in. But then we had to create a completely different narrative if we were no longer conquering. And the
Mm,
narrative that was created was to separate individuals into these races. And it was an easy identifier for me to now base it on skin because that's external. That's something that you can never turn off, right? And with that came the globalization of racism. And then underneath that is the globalization of colorism. While I was over in Spain, I was chatting with my sister. I don't speak Spanish, she does fluently. And while we were there, we were on a bus heading from Madrid to Granada, Spain. And while we were heading down, there was a gentleman who was on the bus, and he was from Central America. And you could tell he was from Central America and wasn't from Spain because of his skin color, right? He had, as opposed to like a lighter olive skin, it was a deeper, olive,
mhm, mhm,
right? And as we went into a rest stop to grab something to eat, use the bathroom, etc. And I was listening to the way that a woman was speaking to the patrons who was there. Again, I don't speak Spanish, but
mhm,
I saw that she was having conversations with a few individuals who were before him, checking out. Very calm, nice conversations, buenos dias, etc. And just kind of
mhm,
going through and chatting and all of that. And when she had gotten to him, the demeanor changed. The
mm,
the 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 tonality changed. The crescendos that used to be in the voice were now completely gone. Everything was monotone. And I had asked my sister, and she was like, "Yeah, it's because he's from Central America." You can easily begin to see because of the fact that
and you don't even need language.
right,
It's
right,
just you just saw the body language change to recognize like people like the power of words is very like powerful, but it is in the tonal delivery that the power behind the words truly take effect,
yeah,
right?
absolutely,
Yes, which is
absolutely.
why like having a debate on social media via text and threads is like nah, it's the
Not right,
place.
right, right. That's not the best use of your time.
Right.
But to explicitly help some businesses who are saying to themselves, okay, like where do we start? If Black Lives Matter is a place that you say, you know what, I resonate with this. This is something that I care about. Places that you can start are, as Ruoyun was saying, what are those three things, two things? Maybe it's just one that you want to start on. Because the moment that you begin to peel the layer back, we start to talk about things like voter suppression. We talk about things like housing suppression and redlining. We talk about things like the school to prison pipeline. We talk about things like wage gap disparities. We can go and go, police brutality. We can
Right.
continue to go, and the war on drugs. I've got more and more that we can consistently go into. And I understand that for some people, they said that I can take a bite out of this onion. And then
Mhm.
once they took a bite out of the onion, they realized that, ooh, there are some
Mhm.
additional things that come with taking a bite out of this onion. There's the
Mhm.
acid that now is in my mouth. There are areas in my mouth that now begin to burn. My tongue begins to burn. Once we realize that we have to get into these private places, that's why it excites me as to where we are. I'm not saying that we've gotten to where I want us to go to, or where we're at a place to where we can really start to talk about equality. There hasn't been enough equity to even start talking about equality. That's another
No,
question,
we
or
got a long way to
conversation.
go.
Right. That's another
Yeah.
conversation. But to get to a point of where we're now able to talk about those private things, right? Those private things. I was mentoring some students out at a local school, the football team, and we were in there. And as we were going in and talking, all the students were coming up, shaking my hand. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for talking to us, etc. And there were a few gentlemen came up, shook my hand, etc. And I took them back afterwards, right? And I said,
Mhm.
hey, I just want to have a really quick conversation with you. I understand that you're in football. I understand that you've been running around, you've been sweating, all that other stuff. We didn't have practice today, but the way that you smell, it's not a pleasant smell. I don't know if anyone has had this type of conversation with you, but let me have this type of conversation with you.
Mhm.
Because if you're just going in the shower and you're lathering up your face, your chest, your back, your legs and feet, and you hop out, did you take a shower? Technically, sure.
Mhm.
But did you get into those private places? Because it's the private places where the bacteria lives. It's the private places
Right.
where
Right.
it's stinky. It's the private places where the waste, right,
Yeah.
that has been kind of tossed out by humanity begins to live, or the places where people dump on
Right.
humanity. And we
Right.
have to get into those private places. We have to get underneath the arms and into the crevices of our
Yeah.
bodies, underneath the folds, etc., so that we can begin to clean and have conversations and acknowledge what's been going on. There's no reconciliation without acknowledgement. So we
Right.
first
Like
have to get to that acknowledgement. And I'm happy that some people, their eyes are open to where we can get to acknowledging the fact that things aren't right, that
mhm.
things aren't fair, that things aren't equal, that as Thomas Jefferson sat and wrote, all men are created equal, he did that with a slave in the room who happened to be his
Mhm.
brother-in-law, right? The
Mhm.
juxtaposition that you have to mentally be going through to be
Mhm.
able to justify the, I don't even want to say unfair, the unhumane treatment and practices
Right.
towards another individual. Now, having a young daughter, one of my things that hit me all the time was anytime she had to use the bathroom and we were on a road
Mhm.
trip. I was like, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, okay. Now that she's 11, it's a whole lot different. Now I can
Yeah.
send her in and be around and let her go to the women's bathroom. But before, I had to take her to the men's bathroom. I had to kind of
Yeah.
hold her and all of that. And I mean, gas station bathrooms in general are not the greatest. But I sit and I think about how I would take my daughter to the bathroom, and taking her to the bathroom every single time we went somewhere, it caused anxiety. It didn't matter if we were in a restaurant, it didn't matter if we were on a road trip, etc. But I want to use the case of a road trip in the case of a gas station bathroom because I know that we'll all be able to resonate with this. And it was going inside that bathroom and seeing how disheveled things were, seeing that toilet paper was everywhere, seeing that there were items on the seat, things that were not flushed, right? Like, I want to paint this picture for you
Mhm.
because I want you to now think about the fact that these bathrooms are actually being maintained. Someone is coming in at some point in time and, at the very least, picking the items up off the floor and putting them into a trash can or sweeping them into a dustpan to put into a trash can for later. These
Mhm.
bathrooms are being attended to. Now, I want you to think back, and not far back, but think back to the 1960s when
Mhm.
segregation was still alive and well. My mom was born in 61,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And it's like we keep thinking that this was so long ago. It wasn't that long ago,
Yeah,
right?
people think World War II is long ago, and I was like, you do realize that there's still people that is alive, right? That survived
Right.
World War II. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So it's bringing individuals back because I understand that this is a very fast-paced world. Technology has moved and shifted things so quickly and so rapidly, and I get that. But we have to acknowledge the fact that this was not that long ago. And if I bring you back to these dirty bathrooms that are at these gas stations that individuals are still attending, and this is not a slight at people working at gas stations or attendants or anything like that. God bless you. Thank you for doing the work that you do. Because as soon as the pandemic started, it was a lot of these gas stations and a lot of these attendants at the gas stations who were putting their lives in harm's
Right.
way to be able to help individuals gain some of the things that they needed because they were unable to find them in other places, right? So
Mhm.
this is not a slight against that. But again, I want to paint this picture. So you've got this bathroom that's being maintained. You still walk in, it's still nasty, it's still disgusting. Now imagine if that bathroom was never maintained. Imagine
Mhm.
if that bathroom was never cleaned. Imagine if that toilet was always clogged. Imagine if there was trash and toilet paper all over the floor and had been there forever. Imagine if the sink was never cleaned, there was no soap. Imagine if you were walking into a place that was absolutely filthy and disgusting. And the moment that you imagine that, I want you to put a sign on that door that says colored only.
Mm.
And I want you to understand that this is a deep rooted history that we have because of the globalization of racial tension, racial injustice, racialization, to be able to say that someone is subhuman simply because of the color of their skin.
Right. And like let's be very adamantly clear on that because I don't think people quite understand and why you hear people say, well, all lives matter. And I was like, no, 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 you don't understand. The reason why we talk about this specific and we started with talking about fixing and hopefully healing, keynote healing, because all of that is trauma. That is trauma inducing environments. Let's just start there, right? Like it is not just about let me fix. It's not and it's not like you go into a chiropractor and an Asian chiropractor and you don't know what the heck is going on. They just go, I fix, and you're like, no, you've dealt insane amount of trauma and you have to be healed on all sides, right? So like there's that piece, but the trauma and the root that Koy mentioned just now is when we say subhuman, it means that, and why we're talking about this problem first is because they like the black group in all areas of the world um, were the ones that were treated as not human, period, simply by the color of their skin. Women even have this too. Like women can empathize a little bit more. It's like, did you know, like in 1910, a woman in in like United Kingdom could be sent to a cattle, like literally, like you're walked into like a farm cattle, and you could be sold off as a woman because women did not own property or can own their rights. Like everyone loves Bridgerton, which is like the trending thing, right? And I was like, did you notice that women in there don't own property? they don't own their name. The moment that they're given to another family, right? Like there's all of these things. And that is why you saw things like suffragettes. That is why you saw the women's movement in that space, right? And we have managed to do that for women for the most part across the world. And I say most, there are still women in that exact same situation today, right? And we're now doing it for this, right? This is both in both of these instances, it is the act of a human being no longer being respected as a human being. They are not even respected to the level of really good pasture raised like animals. Right?
I think it's very interesting that you say that. I mean, we live in, not only live in America where we can turn on a faucet and have clean water. For
Mhm.
most places, there's still issues going on in Flint, which is still mind-boggling to me. Um,
Yes.
but living in Austin as well, we see the way that even dogs are treated,
Mm.
right? We
Yeah.
see the way that even dogs are treated.
Yeah.
And you begin to think about that and you begin to ruminate on that a bit. And the moment that you do, you start to now physically see the dehumanization of human beings simply because of the color of their
Mm-hmm.
skin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's that, again, private place that we all have to get into. And
Mm-hmm.
I know it's super easy for us to say, well, I didn't do that. And
Mm.
for those who say, I didn't do that, I would say, thank you.
Yeah.
I would also say, and what are you doing to change?
Mm.
What are you doing to change it? Because just because you didn't do it doesn't mean someone in your family didn't. Doesn't mean a
Mm.
friend didn't. Doesn't mean someone that you care about didn't. How can we
Right.
continue to elevate this conversation?
Right.
And
And it's not about the shame. I also want to like quickly chime in on that because
right,
they're like we're talking about these things like to Koy's analogy is like we're going to the private areas, we're going to the nitty gritty, we're going into the shadow lands that like nobody likes to face, and it's shameful to say, right? Like as an Asian American, or there's a running joke that like we are probably one of the most judgmental, borderline racist kind of like groups of people. You just can't hear it because we usually say it in our own language, but we have another name for it. It's called homogeneity. We're homogeneous, meaning everybody that's not insert whatever country we're a part of is below us. Like there's that piece. Like we're not saying like, oh, you're subhuman. It's just like we don't. But it's again, it's the form of otherism,
correct.
right? And that's the piece that's the truest knot that we're actually trying to like move aside is otherism. It goes as extreme as racism where you are completely not counted as being human, all the way up to like stereotyping, and stereotyping applies to everything, right? Like we're talking like um people like stereotype others based on the clothes that they wear versus the hair color. Like I have purple hair, and most people that know me, I'm like the most strategical professional person, but I'm like purple hair is my self-expression. And 90% of the time, like right now, it looks really dark compared with lighting. So that's okay. But like you can't stereotype me for being unprofessional for having purple hair, right?
Absolutely.
Like that is the piece to it, and that's the culture conversation when we talk about diversity and inclusivity as a whole, right? Like that's what our end goal of which we're trying to go towards, inequality. But I say all of this in the sense that at some point one person has judged another person based on stereotypes and assumptions. And when we say things like we've been using very like deep, powerful examples to really like just say, let me bring it clear on these things, because a lot of times when you read about this stuff, you just get surface level examples. We're giving very true, blunt, and honest examples. But I also want to point out is that no matter if it's a small stereotype that you feel judged by, or if you have a previous family member, um it's not like, don't like, you shouldn't feel like, you shouldn't let your shame take you,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. I mean, shame stops progress, shame stops conversations, shame stops connecting, shame stops so much. And I'm right there with you, Lauren. It's not about the shame. And I'm not here to tell another individual how to feel, right?
Mhm, mhm,
There are certainly shameful areas that I have in my life that
mhm,
I have to uncover, that I have to release, that I have to let go. What I will say is, what has helped me to do that is through conversation.
mm, yeah.
I was chatting with the CFO yesterday, and he was talking about kind of the culture at the company, and used a word, and the word is ambitious. And
That's the word?
the way that he defined ambitious was to have the ambition, right, of wanting to strive, wanting to get better, wanting to achieve,
Uh-huh.
but to have the humility that
Ah,
if it's something that you're working on that you haven't worked on before, something that you're working on that's not necessarily in your strength or expertise, that you have the humility to ask. You have the humility to seek out the answers. You have the humility to have a conversation. And when I heard that, I like underlined that bad boy like 5 times, right? Because being ambitious is an area that we have to move into. We have to drive and strive to become better, to continue to evolve as a human race, and we have to do it with humility. How can I get the help that I need? How can I get the answers to the questions that I have? Maybe I don't understand police brutality because it's never happened to me. And because it's never happened to me, it's difficult for me to understand that. But again, we first
mhm,
start with acknowledgement. Just because I haven't gone through it, experienced it, doesn't mean it didn't happen to you. Doesn't mean it's not a part of your reality. Doesn't mean it's not something that you face.
right.
And by simply acknowledging, now I have an opportunity to say, I never experienced that before. And I really don't know how that would make me feel. But I can tell that it's something that deeply affects you. And I
Mhm.
would like to do my part as an ally to one, acknowledge you, to two, validate you, to know that what you've experienced is what you've experienced. It is real. It's not make believe. It's not something in your head. We got to stop gaslighting people. Like we keep and that's what we were doing before. You're just playing the race card. No, like this is happening and it's been
Mhm.
happening and it's deeply rooted. And then once we move from acknowledgement into validation, now we've got to move into the conversation, right?
Mhm.
What is that dialogue? How can you now begin to have more conversations so that you can get a fuller picture? We're literally trying to solve an elephant type problem by only touching one area of the elephant. We
Right.
have to understand all of these different perspectives. We have to get as much of a 360-degree view of this issue, of this challenge, of this ism, as you said, Lauren, in
Mhm.
order for us to begin to reconcile. But it's going to
Right.
take acknowledgement first.
Right. It has to take, that's like step one, right? And that's like what we're seeing when we're talking about marketing from a marketing perspective and things like that. That's like the starting point is a year ago, we have started acknowledging, keynote started
Start.
acknowledging,
Yes.
right? It's like, I'm aware. Have I
Yes.
learned the depth of it, etc.? And the piece that, like, if I kind of recapture what we've experienced this year, right, is we've acknowledged, we're starting to deep dive, and everyone's at different levels, right? Because
Correct.
we also have a pandemic at the same time. And so it's like your mental ability to receive. That's the keynote, right? The mental ability to receive and process is based on how much you're letting your ego kick in.
Yeah.
And shame feeds ego. Shame is what stops progress, but it's like it and the how it does that is by feeding ego
Mm,
to that space, right? Like, and that's what you mean by like with humility, right? It's the ability to be vulnerable. Like you hear this a lot in the circles of like business owners and leaders and entrepreneurs, because like we joke that business ownership is like the most intense personal growth journey you could take, right? So
yeah,
we can call it out for what it is, which is
yeah,
like vulnerability, right? But for the normal average human being saying like, oh, you got to be vulnerable, they're like, what, friend? What?
right, yeah,
They're like, what? What is vulnerability? And I'm like, okay, how about humility? Let's start
yes,
there, right?
yes,
And so it is honoring in that space. And I love your example of like acknowledge and validate that other person, but I and like then have conversations. But my keynote to that piece as an adding of that conversation is you don't need to fix, right? This is not a like chiropractors talk about this and we talk about the body like it's like the elephant body. It's the body, right? Like this is a knot, it's a muscle knot. And this is why chiropractors, whether you believe in them or not, or fitness instructors or physical therapists will say you got to go back for multiple sessions, right? We're literally taking essentially you've had this knot and this knot started other knots and other knots and other knots. And eventually you could be paralyzed. Literally. Like that's what's happening in our world, in our society, in our organizations, right? And so we're taking care of this knot. It is painful. When you go into a massage therapist or a physical therapist, they're going to say, we're going to get rid of this knot. But then you got to go take an Epsom bath. You
hmm
got to go relax. You got to be able to process. You got to let go. There's toxins that we're moving aside. And it's not a band-aid issue. Like
no,
we can't pull the only band-aid pulling effect that you have is acknowledging that it exists. But to eventually fix and heal, most importantly, heal this, like create new neurons and new pathways, is to be able to like give time and space associated with it, right?
absolutely,
And like allow these conversations like there's this it's interesting because when we talk about conversations like for like the very intense um proactive people out there, you don't have to be an activist, you could just be like really proactively like we got to fix this, we got to do this thing, we got to do this thing,
right,
right? And I'm like, and me as a growing up in Asian culture where we think 25 years in advance, I'm like, hold on, you're not going to fix this in a year or 3 months or an hour meeting. First off, it's going to be at least a 3 hour meeting and you're going to have multiple of those 3 hour
right,
meetings, right?
right,
But it's those like you have to like do it because here's the thing, it's about healing. If you tell victims to be healed in a day, you're not giving them the space to heal. It's literally, and let me give a more um easily connected analogy. What you just described in those 3 steps is talking to someone dealing with depression, anxiety, suicide. You don't tell an emotionally abused or domestically abused victim or rape victim or a depression a person that's depressed or a suicide survivor or even a cancer survivor. Like you don't talk to these people and say, I acknowledge you, I validate you. Okay, we're gonna fix in a day. Like you don't say that, right? So why would you say that about racism? That's that I wanna call some like let's like give some blunt honest love, hard love on this
yes,
is and the thing that we're healing is our mind. Like neurons take time.
yeah, they do,
Like if I have to link like science articles, I will for those that if someone comments like I don't believe you, I'm like, here's the link. Like
absolutely,
we're reshifting our mindset,
yes, yeah, yes,
right?
and it can be done. Because I think that that's the other side, right? It's like, oh my gosh, reshifting the mind. How do I do? It can be done. There's again, if we need to link articles around neuroplasticity and what the brain can do, how we can train ourselves to do X, Y, Z, right? Like it can be done. It will take
Yeah.
some repetition. It will take some practice, but it can be done. The knot can be removed, and we can move on to the next knot stronger, together, more whole. And you find that it's not that things get easier, it's just that you get better. If we attach
Mhm.
this back to a video game, my daughter and I were playing one last night, and there was a level that I saw that she was getting to, and she just could not pass that level. And she just, every time that she would restart, she would keep going back to that same boss and going back to that same boss and going back to that same boss. And I said, okay, babe, I've now watched you go back to the same boss 5 times and lose. I love the tenacity, right? I love the resilience. Let me praise the things that I love and I enjoy. And then let me offer another perspective, right? I don't want to change your mind. I just want to add to your perspective. Here's another perspective. Here's what dad used to do whenever he was playing Zelda back in the day. I'm so happy that they've revamped a lot of these games for the
Oh my
Nintendo.
God, Legend of Zelda is the
Yeah.
best. Yes, yes,
So,
yes.
and I mean, for my millennials out there, I'm talking about like Nintendo 64, Super
Yeah.
Nintendo, right? Like, so here we are now.
Well, life is, let me before you go into your example, because I think it helps add some context, is my favorite example that I started seeing in 2020 was like majority of the world just got, there's this concept of woke, right? Let me like,
Oh my gosh, yes.
we're gonna like, we're gonna redefine that real quickly. It's like, I'm like, sweetie, getting woke, it does not mean that you have now fixed your problems. It's like you just become aware, right? Like that's step number one. And my joke is that welcome to the real story of life. It's not like the board game life where it's like a linear journey and you're like doing all these like outwardly milestones. No, it's like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild,
Yeah.
free flow. You can go in any order. But the key to beating the game is building your character reps, because you can get the best sword in the whole entire world. But if you don't got that character development built up, you're going to wield like 90 damage versus the potential 9,000 damage, and you're just going to get killed by the bosses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right.
Right?
So now that you mentioned woke, I just really quickly got to touch on that because I'm with you here. This is a word that has now become ubiquitous with Black Lives Matter and everybody needs to get woke and all this other stuff. And what I typically say when an individual says either they are woke or this other person is woke, etc., my question back is how woke?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Whoa. I mean, like, all of this is on a spectrum. And if we now
Right.
need to bring it into physical analogy for us to begin to understand, there are times where your alarm clock goes off at 7 a.m. and mine goes off at 4.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I've already been up 3 hours longer than you, how woke are you? That's the first one. But the second one is for that alarm clock that goes off at 7, sometimes people hit snooze.
I hit snooze
I feel
more
like we've got
sometimes
a
too.
lot. I feel like we've got a lot of individuals who have woken up, right? The
Yes.
alarm went off, but they're
Yep.
still in bed and they're contemplating: Am I going to get up? Am I going to get out of bed? Right? And because all of that is going on and all of that's happening, you then say to yourself, well, how woke are you really? Because it's
Mm-hmm.
on a spectrum, and we have to understand that it's on a spectrum, and we also have to give people the grace that they need, right?
Yeah,
To
because like
get
if
out of
the
bed.
3 hours, right, exactly. Because like we were there for 3 hours, aka 5 years,
Right.
right? Like if you're at that further on level, and there's actually like a progress of where you become woke, so you're aware of the situation, and then you're starting to understand the situation and you seek change. That's a change seeker.
Right.
But there's a difference between a change seeker and a change maker. A change seeker is I see the situations that's happening and I seek change, but I don't believe I have the individual power to seek change.
Sure.
And then there's a change maker, and change makers are not only leadership people.
Correct.
Change maker, this spectrum is human evolution.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not
Absolutely.
about organizations, right? Change
No.
maker is that I believe I can make a change in the world, big or small. Like you don't need to be like Bill Gates doing a bajillion. No, like that's
Right.
not the intention, right? Like it's like what can you impact a single day? Because if every single one of us chose to make a small impact in a single day, that is multiple single drops in a wave of in an ocean that creates a wave of impact. That's the key. And then there are some of us that are change leaders who essentially have been a change maker for a long time and is recognizing that it's time for us to inspire others to do the same. We figured it out just enough so that we can start inspiring others. Are we still growing? Absolutely. But to that point is like that's a full journey
Right.
of what it looks like, and you can land on any of that stuff. And if you've woken up 3 hours beforehand, or before the other person, or aka 5 years of personal development work before, you can give the grace. Like how hard it was for you to get yourself to wake up 3 hours ahead of,
Right.
right? Like
Right.
give that person the grace for it, right? It's again back to shame, right? Like if our goal is to implement and do success and implement change so that our world and our future and our future generations have a better chance at life, like they don't need to be at just waking up. They can start, they could already be developed as starting to be change makers. Imagine an evolution of our world if we can get to that point. That would be amazing, right? But
Uh,
like you got to have some grace, faith
absolutely.
and grace, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
So
So tangenting back into the original example of like the boss and of for your daughter, because
yes,
we had to give some context, because I feel like so that we're all on the same page to fully embrace this analogy. Yeah.
absolutely. So I hate that I will have to end with this analogy, Lauren, because I also want to talk about your change seeker, your change maker, and your change leader. And whenever we talk about grace, I want to also share with the audience the power of 10 and how important it is for you to understand who you're speaking to with regard to the power of 10. But let's go back to the analogy, and I'll end with this. As my daughter and I were playing, as she went and was fighting the boss, 5 different times, I see her lose. And I could tell that the resilience was starting to wane. She was getting to a point of where she said, you know what, I don't even want to play this game anymore. And I had gotten to that point so many times playing games when I was younger too, where I just don't, you know what, forget this game. Let me go play something else, right? And what I had to help her to understand was the reason why, whenever you are starting this game, you're not immediately starting at the boss is because the game is giving you the opportunity to, number one, take your time. Number two, go back to previous levels that you might need to go back to. Number three, get some more practice fights in so that you can build your character development, so that you can build your magic acumen, your defense acumen, your attack acumen. The game doesn't start you right there in the boss every single time, right?
Right.
And because of that, you still have a choice and you have a decision. And it's important for us, again, from a ambitious perspective, to say, hey, I am ambitious enough to continuously going into the area with this boss and fighting this boss. And I applaud you for that. I applaud you for that. But a lot of times, what you'll find is that you have not been adequately prepared to face that boss. There are times where you can go in and you can face a boss and you can defeat it because you had preparation before that you didn't recognize. This is a different boss. We're on a different level. And because of that, we have to ensure that we have the skill sets needed for the new boss that we're facing and the journey after that boss. Because life is about new bosses and new bosses and new bosses if we continue to keep it in this video game analogy. And I'll end with this. Everybody needs to get into their spot. You need to know what it is that you do. Where is your strength? If you are a change seeker, then be the best damn change seeker you can be. If you're a change leader or a change maker, then be the best damn change leader or change maker that you can be. If this is currently something that is not for you, I get it as well. Sit on the sideline, be a spectator. Maybe you're just cheering. Maybe you want to be silent, but don't stand in the way of other individuals who are running this race, right?
Right.
There's
Connect you, if you don't want to be the voice, connect them to the voice.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So Warren, oh my gosh, I appreciate you. I feel like we could do this so
There-
many times over. I am excited for the work that you're doing. I would love to, come back and explore and dive in deeper into
Yeah.
this topic and, any other topics that you feel I would be able to add value to. I truly appreciate the fact that you are a change leader as well, helping to inspire individuals, other change makers, other change seekers to be able to step out and do what they have been put here to do. So I appreciate you and the work you do.
Thank you. I appreciate the work and you do because you are breaking down these what I call shame barriers. Well, in marketing we call it mindset barriers if we're talking about adoption cycle and stuff like that in marketing.
Right.
But these are shame barriers, right? Like mindset barriers are actually partially shame barriers as well. But I'm so thankful to have you here and thank you so much for being on this IGTV series. We have just, I think, so what before as we end this, let's just walk away with one note for them on this is that we are at the beginning, right? Like just like Koy mentioned, like we could go on and on and on. We might explore some other mediums, like maybe Clubhouse or Twitter audio spaces might be a fun way to talk about this. We'll talk, we'll see. We'll see. Comment below if you're interested in if you have additional topics and conversations. Like I said, we just all that Koy and I did for you guys today is set the scene, right? Like a lot of what we did in the conversation today is to kind of like call BS out on the ambiguity of this conversation, right? And to our original question of what do I do a year? Like, I'm going to have my customers or my people asking me, we've been a year into this, right? It's that ambitiousness, right? To be able to transparently communicate that in your culture and in your brand voice to say, we're hitting a year. We are nowhere near done. And we honor and recognize that we're nowhere near done, but these are the focuses that we want to do. And that's what I hope that this conversation for any of you that whether you're a leader or like whether you're a leader, a business owner, or even just a social media manager who's like dealing front line with a lot of these conversations from your people, that you get to walk away from this conversation to say, okay, I now know how to set my container to really dig deep with my team to have these conversations. And if you need a facilitator, because this is really personal, private conversations, definitely talk to someone like Koy as well, because he will give like follow him on his social. I love his videos. It just like it's like that day of motivation from his energy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren.